Hi, everyone. Welcome to this YouTube channel. Today, I am speaking with Anthony Lewis. Anthony Lewis is an American astrologer, researcher. He's a retired psychiatrist, a major in mathematics, has written several books on astrology, one on horary astrology, also on tarot. I'm very delighted to have him on. Today, we're going to be talking about solar returns. Hi, Anthony. How are you?
Hi, Levi. How are you? Good to see you again.
It's really good to see you. We discussed this a little bit before you agreed to do some presentation. Perhaps we can start with explaining a little bit for the beginners watching this, what solar returns are, some history perhaps, because I know you're very conscious of the root of certain concepts, ideas that we find in the ancient Hellenistic and the medieval, even Persian astrology practices, correct?
Yes. You asked me to speak this week, and I'm kind of rushed because I'm preparing to leave on a trip for Spain, where I'll be speaking on solar returns in San Sebastian next week at the 36th Congress of Astrology, Iberian Congress of Astrology. I've been preparing for that, so that's why I chose solar return. For beginners, the idea of a solar return is quite simple. The idea is that we're all born in a particular place at a particular time. That's our birth chart. Ancient astrologers, and I'm referring back to Hellenistic times, like 2,000 years ago, began to try to do a forecast for the year ahead for their clients. And one of the techniques they used was very simple. On the day of the birthday, when the sun returned to where it was in the birth chart, they would look at the transits for that day, place the transiting planets around the birth chart, and then interpret the interactions of the birth planets and the transiting planets, including what houses they were in, what aspects they were making. And based on this, they felt they could get a general, or like a weather forecast or climate forecast for the year ahead. Mm-hmm. This technique was then picked up by the Persian Arabic astrologers, who refined it considerably. And by the 7th, 8th century, had a whole system for analyzing what might happen in the year ahead. So it wasn't just the solar return. They would look at many other predictive techniques. I think it was finally Abu Mashar who wrote the key book summarizing what he'd learned from his teachers. And really, I think for the first time talking about the solar return as if it were a separate individual chart that you could study in addition to and in conjunction with the natal chart. Always stressing that you can never interpret the solar return chart without reference to the natal chart. The idea being that the birth chart is the promise for the whole lifetime. Mm-hmm. And the solar return is just one key point, your annual birthday, your annual return of the sun, that was considered more significant than other points in the year because your sun returned to its original place. And this, I think, had to do with the idea of cycles. Cycles were very important throughout the history of astrology, especially in Hellenistic times where Alexander the Great had brought the Babylonian astrology to Egypt. Mm-hmm. In Egypt, it was very important to pay attention to the cycles, annual cycles, because the Nile would flood every year. So if you weren't ready for it, it could spell the end of your civilization. So this idea of each year something important happens on or near a particular date, and you must pay attention to that date to know how the coming year would unfold, is the basic idea of solar returns. But I think it was sort of implicit in the Egyptian culture, the agricultural culture, the reliance on the Nile and its flooding, mm-hmm. and the need to pay attention to the sort of the celestial indications that the Nile was about to flood. That's how I think about it.
Makes sense, yeah.
And so the Hellenistic astrology, I think, is a mixture of many, many traditions, cultures, and philosophical movements. And so out of these, there grew a whole set of techniques to predict how the year would go. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, initially, the solar return was really the transits on the day of the birth, the anniversary of the birth. And part of the issue in calculating the solar return was that 2,000 years ago, there weren't instruments precise enough to measure exactly when the sun would return to its original location at birth. So to get around this, the Egyptians and Greeks had fairly precise and accurate measurements of the length of a year, tropical year.
A solar
They were
year.
able, and they had that down to close to the minute.
Mm-hmm.
So what they would do is simply, or the technique that evolved was simply, if you know your birth date and time, you simply add the length of one tropical year to get the first solar return. Then you add the length of a tropical year to that to get the second solar return. So you're really adding lengths of tropical years to the birth moment to generate a chart, regardless of whether the sun was exactly at its birth location. The sun might be off a little bit by a few minutes of arc. It probably was not exactly where it was to the minute and second at birth, but it was close enough to generate a chart. And I think this Persian Arabic method went into India and became part of Vedic astrology, I think because of trade and intercultural exchanges. And I'm relatively ignorant of Vedic astrology, but from the little I've read about Vedic solar returns, they use this method of adding the length of the year, except they were using the sidereal year.
Exactly.
Instead of the exact location of the sun. To recently, I think they still do it, although I think some have adopted. With computers now, you can really know exactly where the sun was. But there is a difference, because if you simply add the average length of the year, you may get a different ascendant than if you correct the sun to its precise location. You may be off by one sign. Each minute of arc the sun is off is 24 minutes on the clock. So if you have an ascendant that's near the cusp, 24 minutes can push it into the next sign. And so just 1 minute of arc can give you a different ascendant, which then might affect your interpretation of the solar return. Nowadays, I think, in the West, everybody uses a precise location of the sun because we can measure it and we have computers that can tell us exactly when it happened.
Your solar return is going to be off by the minutes that your birth time is off.
Other issues with solar return, in terms of calculation, there is an issue of, do you calculate it for your birthplace or do you calculate it for your current location at the time you return? Until the 17th century, it was always done at the birthplace. This was a tradition, I think, because initially it was just the transits around the natal chart, which was calculated for the birthplace. So the solar return was a chart considered with respect to the birthplace. In the 17th century, the French astrologer, Morin de Villefranche, he wrote this, he was a brilliant astrologer, wrote this wonderful volume that's really never been fully translated from Latin. There are separate parts of it are translated into English, French, and Spanish, as far as I know. But no one has completely translated the entire book from Latin into another language. So there's a consistent, integrated translation. He is one of those, in my opinion, one of those brilliant astrologers who ever lived. And he was of the opinion that astrology should be a science. And anything that wasn't purely scientific, as he understood science, modern science, should be discarded. So he knew the literature quite well. He read through it, and he just discarded anything that smacked to him of superstition. He called them fantasies of the Arabs. So a lot of the techniques that the Hellenistic astrologers had and the Persian Arabic astrologers had developed from 2,000 years ago through say maybe the 9th century were just thrown out. He just threw them out because he thought they were fantasies. Techniques that, if you read Vettius Valens, he used them and they seem quite effective, and that they're being sort of reintroduced now with the revival of interest in ancient astrology. Probably the most notable being the profections. But let me finish with Morin. So Marinus decided that the planets really were like physical forces. And so, as in physics, a force can only exert an effect on something in a location. If the thing is not in that location, they can't exert an effect on it. It just doesn't make sense. If I push you, you move backwards because you're there in front of me. But if you're not in front of me and I push where I thought you might have been, it doesn't affect you, right? There's no physical effect. So Marinus argued that you have to calculate it only for where the person is at the moment it occurs, because you're receiving forces from the heavens. So it's a very mechanistic scientific viewpoint, which is in contrast to what I think is the older viewpoint that the planets are really messages from the heavens. They're means of communication. On some level, the universe is communicating with us symbolically. So the planets are symbols, and it really isn't essential where you're sitting or standing to understand what the symbol means. Right? I can understand the symbol whether I'm in Rome or in New York. It's the same symbol. My location doesn't affect necessarily the symbolic meaning. I think the very traditional approach would be to calculate the solar return for the birthplace. If you're of a scientific bent and think the planets are actually affecting you with physical forces, then Marinus's idea that you do it for your location makes more sense.
What did he base that belief on, which was then, in his mind, a scientific way of doing astrology, right? I mean, if we consider the influence that planets have on Earth nowadays, if you would ask the average person, I think they would strongly object, and even science would strongly object.
You're born in Belgium, right? He would say, suppose on your solar return, you're visiting New York. He would say, you have to do the chart for New York because you physically, your body is in New York and your body is receiving planetary forces. Belgium is also receiving those planetary forces, but you're not there to get them. Your natal chart is in Belgium, but you're in New York. So his argument would be, how could a force in a location so distant from where you personally are at that moment have any influence on you? It makes no sense to him. Whereas the more traditional view would be that in Belgium, where you were born, your natal chart is always part of who you are, and any influence to that natal chart will reflect how your life develops. And so we study the influences to your natal chart in its location. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. But my point was, like, the planets themselves and the influence they exert on life on Earth. I mean, that's quite a statement. Even Carl Sagan would strongly object to that.
Oh, I object to it. I think I don't agree with it.
Right.
But this was Marinus's viewpoint. We have to be scientific. We have to accept that the planets are forces. They're physical causes. They affect us, body and soul, only where we're at. They can't affect us in a place where we're not. And I think most modern astrologers adopt that viewpoint, although they probably wouldn't say that the planets are forces. But I have Marinus somewhere. I should have pulled out my Marinus. Oh, actually I do.
Sure.
Here's the book. The chart is erected for the place of the nativity, not by reason of the place, but by reason of the birth of the native. That's the natal chart. He says, I erect the solar return for the latitude of the place in which the native is found at the very moment of the revolution. The celestial influx, this is the influence of the planets, on the genethaliacal, that's the natal constitution, is imprinted on the native alone, who carries it with him wherever he will have taken himself. So Marinus is saying that when you're born, your natal chart becomes part of who you are, and it loses its connection with the location. It's just part of your body. And so wherever you are, your chart is. That's his viewpoint.
Yeah, so he kept their whole metaphysical way of thinking, and their metaphysical system was that the planets actually exert some kind of energy onto life on Earth.
Right. His book was published in 1661. He was dead by then. So he was writing in the mid 1600s. Copernicus was a century before. Galileo was the beginning of the 1600s.
Yes.
It's interesting that in terms of consistency, when we do progressions, secondary progressions, usually we do them with reference to the birth chart at the birthplace. We don't usually do them with respect to the relocated chart. Like if you were to move to New York, you would probably look at your progressions with respect to Belgium. The same with transits. We generally, if we look at transits, we're looking at our birth chart at the birth location.
Yeah.
So to be consistent with Marinus's position, you'd have to do all your astrological techniques with your birth chart relocated to where you are. And I mean, there may be astrologers who do that. I don't know of many.
That's always the question, right? Are these things actually tested? And of course, when people put their minds onto certain techniques, then because of the nature of our mind, we fill in all sorts of gaps, I would say, because we, basically don't really know ourselves too deeply. So I think it's one of the fundamental issues with astrological research.
Well, I think relocated charts are very important and worth studying. But I don't see it as an either or. When I do solar returns, I look at both. I look at the solar return at the birthplace and the solar return at the current location. Often they give a different emphasis or they highlight different things that both turn out to happen. So they both seem accurate, but from different perspectives.
And of course, you're a very experienced astrologer because you've been into astrology since the 80s. You know what you're talking about. And
well, I hope so.
Yeah, well, I think it's worthwhile testing.
But essentially, I always do both because I find that sometimes the birthplace is more compelling than the relocated chart, and sometimes the relocated chart is more compelling than the birthplace. But they both usually give very interesting perspectives and maybe say something different. It actually makes a lot of sense because it's rare that if there's some major event in your life, it only affects one area of your life. So say it's in the 5th house at your birthplace, but in the 7th house at your relocated place, it may affect your children and your spouse, both. Well, let me say a little about the literature. In my opinion, the most important books on solar returns are the one by Abu Mashar, the Persian Arabic astrologer in the 9th century, because he really summarized the whole development of the concept from Hellenistic times to his own. And he influenced astrologers ongoing after that. They relied on his book for how to do solar returns. And then Marinus in the 17th century, because he sort of revolutionized and made more scientific, he called his approach rational astrology. We have to get rid of nonsense and superstition.
Yes.
Which, again, I think is unfortunate because he threw out techniques that work that are very powerful, but he thought they were nonsense. And then in the last century, there was a Russian French, he was an astrologer who emigrated from Russia to France, Volgin, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, who was fascinated by solar returns and had a school of astrology, and he and his students, over the course of a few decades, studied hundreds, if not thousands of charts. He wrote a book about his findings, and he had a journal where he published his findings. And so what is valuable about his work is that it's not just theoretical. He wrote down what happened to actual people, hundreds of people, thousands of clients. And his approach was very like Marinus. He would take the birth chart, superimpose the solar return around it, and then look at connections, house cusp connections, angle connections, planets that connected from the return to the natal and vice versa. And then he would make interpretation. I think I sent you a copy.
You did, yeah. And I'm also doing it, I think it's a very valid, very interesting, worthwhile technique.
I thought he also superimposed a natal chart on the solar return chart, but I'm not sure if he did that. But that's a technique I use and I find very effective, that you put the solar return planets around the natal chart, see what gets highlighted. Then you take the solar return chart and put the natal planets around it and see what gets highlighted. To go back to Marinus, a point he makes, actually this goes way back, that the principle is nothing will occur in the life that is not promised in the natal chart. So you first have to see it in the natal chart. If it's not in the natal chart, it's not going to happen. Then secondly, the solar return, according to Marinus, and I guess the older authors, will trigger natal configurations. So let's make up an example. Suppose you have a trine in your chart, a nice trine between Jupiter and Venus, really nice. The two benefics are in trine. Say from your 2nd house to your 10th house. This promises that you'll make a lot of money in your career probably, right? Unless there's other indications against it. But that's just sometime in your life you were going to make a lot of money. This trine will get activated. So the solar return, if in that year the solar return planets activate that Venus or that Jupiter, that's a year where that promise is likely to manifest.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if it's a year when Venus and Jupiter form some sort of aspect in the solar return, and which favorably aspects the natal trine, then for sure something's going to happen. That's a good money year for you. Okay.
Yeah.
If you read Valens and the Hellenistic authors, they go into great depth about how do you tell if somebody will be eminent in this lifetime? Eminent meaning prominent in society, not necessarily famous, but have a position of real power and authority, which obviously the presidency would be. And they have a whole technique for judging eminence, which is quite detailed, and I'd have to review it to talk about it coherently. But one thing Valens does frequently, he looks at charts and he says, this person's always going to be a slave. There's nothing eminent in his chart. But this person is going to rise. He may be a governor or a general or something, because he has all these eminent practice for eminence in his chart. I thought it would be interesting to look at the chart of Donald Trump, who certainly, he's eminent and famous. He's not my favorite person, but
sure.
But no one would disagree that this is an eminent person. He has a power of great authority and prominence in society. So he should have some of these eminence indicators, and they should be triggered the year he won the presidential election. And the reason I picked him was back at the time before the election, astrologers are really split. I think most astrologers felt that Hillary Clinton would win.
Oh, yeah.
A few said, no, Trump is going to win. And I thought it'd be good to go back in retrospect and look at his solar return and some of his eminence factors to see if we can see with hindsight. It's always easier knowing what happened. So this Abu Mashar, who wrote the 9th century book on solar returns and the presidential election. And what I want to look at is Donald Trump's chart and see if in hindsight, we can see that he might win the election. For those who don't know Abu Mashar, he was a Persian Arabic astrologer, and he, in his book, listed 19 factors you must study or should study to analyze the solar return. I've only listed the first 7 here, and the first is the profected ascendant, which I'll explain in a minute. This is one thing Marinus threw out. He said, oh, this is superstitious nonsense, get rid of it. But it's really powerful and really effective. Second is the distribution, meaning the ruler of the term that rises to the ascendant by primary direction. And any planet that aspects this. The fourth is the Ferdaria, which is a Time Lord system like Dashas. The fifth is the Lord of the Orb, which has to do with the planetary hour in which someone is born. The sixth is the ascendant of the solar return. The seventh is the moon. And then there are 19 and other. I'm not going to go through all 19. So here's Donald Trump's chart. This is from his birth certificate. What's interesting, most astrologers think he has Leo rising because he sort of fits the personality. But he was born, his natal, I think his birth time was 10:54 in the morning. But I think 13 or 15 seconds later, it shifted into Virgo. So it's possible he has a Virgo ascendant. This is in the tropical zodiac.
Yeah.
In the sidereal, he had no question is a Leo ascendant. But in the tropical, from his birth certificate, we had a Leo ascendant. But if you add 15 seconds to his birth time, you get a Virgo ascendant. So I'm going to go with the Leo since it seems to fit him.
Yes.
He has 29:55 Leo rising. What's interesting, he has the fixed star Regulus, which is the heart of the lion, the heart of Leo, right on his ascendant. Regulus was considered one of the royal fixed stars. I think there were 4 of them.
Yes.
So he's born to be king. Okay.
Back on his ascendant, yeah.
Right on his ascendant. And he has Mars there in fairly close conjunction.
Mm-hmm.
But this is his ascendant, this is 04, this is 55. So it's within less than a degree of his ascendant
Mm-hmm.
and rising. The part of exaltation is a Hellenistic part. It's one of those indicators of eminence. Will you be exalted by the people in your society, held like on a pedestal?
Mm-hmm.
And so his part of exaltation, I calculated to be 25 Gemini 59, so almost 26 of Gemini. He really doesn't have anything there now, but I think it becomes important in the solar return, as we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other factors having to do with eminence in Hellenistic time was this place of acquisition. And in Hellenistic times, they use the part of fortune. His part of fortune is here at the end of Aquarius as an alternate ascendant. So you could erect the chart with the ascending sign rising, but they also looked at a chart with the part of fortune as the ascendant. Mm-hmm. And counted the houses from the part of fortune. And so counting 11 houses from the part of fortune, the 11th house acquisition, because the 11th house was called the joy of Jupiter, the joy of the house of the good spirit, the good daemon, mm-hmm. and the joy of Jupiter. Jupiter is the great benefactor of the zodiac. And the part of fortune has to do with your material well-being. Mm-hmm. So 11 houses from here, that's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, is Sagittarius. So Sagittarius and ruled by Jupiter have a lot to do with his acquiring prominence and riches in this life. Interestingly, his Jupiter, natally, is stationary. Stationary planets were considered extremely powerful. They're not moving, so they stay still for a long time. Mm-hmm. And have a marked effect on the entire life. And interestingly, his Jupiter, his stationary Jupiter, 17 Libra 27, is almost exactly trine his Uranus, 17 Gemini 53, in the 10th house. So here is a natal promise right here of some unexpected prominence at some point in his life. Right? Jupiter, ruler of his place of acquisition. So he will acquire something very important, powerful, unexpectedly at some point in his life, involving the 10th and 2nd houses using Placidus, 3rd house using whole sign. Mm-hmm. And this is the 11th house using whole sign. So that's interesting. So we'd be interested, when does this get triggered? This trine is very nice. Unexpected, mm-hmm. extreme good fortune, right? Would be an interpretation. Mm-hmm. So let me move on. This is the same chart. I just did it so you could see he was born on a Venus day, a Friday, and he was born during a Jupiter hour, which is quite interesting. Mm-hmm. So not only does Jupiter rule his house of acquisition, and is Jupiter in his Placidus 2nd house of wealth, but it rules the hour he was born. Mm-hmm. These are the planets given sort of, there's a point system they use in horary astrology. Interestingly, Venus and Mars are very strong in his chart. Mm-hmm. Jupiter's okay, but anyway. This is the dignity table from Dorotheus. His sun is in Gemini. So the triplicity rulers are the 3 planets that rule the air signs. Mm-hmm. And in a day chart, Saturn is the first planet. So it rules the air signs by day. Mercury is the second planet, so it would rule the air signs by night. And Jupiter is the participating planet, so it would rule the air signs all the time and help out Saturn or Mercury, whichever happens to be, whether it was a day or night chart. All right.
So this is considered a dignity, a kind of a dignity.
Yeah. In traditional, there are 5 dignities, essential dignities. The domicile, which is the sign that the planet rules. The exaltation, which is the sign where the planet is held up, exalted, most respected or honored. For instance, the sun is very honored in Aries, Jupiter in Cancer, etc. The triplicity, these are the rulers of the 3 signs of a single element. Right? So the fire signs are ruled by the sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. The earth signs by Venus, Moon, and Mars. The air signs by Saturn, Mercury, and Jupiter. And the water signs by Venus, Mars, and the Moon.
And that's a fixed order. Yeah.
Yeah. It depends on whether you're born during the day or the night.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's a triplicity. It's a very important triplicity. And in fact, next time we can talk more, but Dorotheus used the triplicity rulers as a major factor in his interpretations. I have an example of that in the next slide, I think. The terms are unequal divisions. Each sign is divided into 5 parts, unequal parts, and each part has a planet that rules it.
Terms or bounds, right?
Bounds, terms are bounds, yeah. Terms are bounds.
Or the Hada, yes.
And you call them Hada, okay?
Yes, the Hada.
Are they the same or are they different?
They are the same, yeah, but there's several, right? There's several
different tables. Yeah. This is the one from Dorotheus. It's one of the oldest, and he was a very active practicing astrologer.
Interesting.
Ptolemy has a table, but Ptolemy was more of an academic encyclopedist who I don't think was a practicing astrologer at all. So I trust more the table of someone who used it every day in his work.
Makes sense, yeah.
And the faces or the decans are simply 10-degree divisions of each sign, starting in Aries with Mars ruling the first decan of Aries, and then it goes in Chaldean order, sort of by the speed of the planets and their distance. So Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and then the outermost planet, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, because you're coming in from the edge of the solar system. Okay. Detriment is opposite the sign that the planet rules. So for instance, Mars rules Aries, so Mars is in detriment in the opposite sign, which is Libra.
Okay.
And Venus rules Libra. And fall is the opposite of the exaltation. The sun is exalted in Aries. In Libra, the sun is in its fall. The 5 essential dignities and 2 essential debilities, right? They're called essential because they have to do with where the planet is at a given moment in the zodiac. There's also something called accidental dignities, which have to do with the house systems. And they're accidental because the house really depends on the moment of birth and your place on Earth.
In Vedic astrology, detriment and fall are not really used. In Varshafal or Tajika Nilakantik gives the Hadas also for the terms. And then Triplicity Lords, of course, we also have in Tajika Nilakanti, but not really in Vedic astrology. But there is a lot of crossover there in Tajika Nilakanti with some Indian concepts. Yeah.
Okay. This is Donald Trump. This is from Donald Trump's chart. So these are his planets and his dignities. So here's his sun. It's in Gemini. It's in the 10th house. I was using Placidus houses. It's his 11th whole sign house. It's ruled by, this is Mercury, ruled by, Gemini is ruled by Mercury. The triplicity rulers are Saturn, Mercury, and Jupiter. Because this is a day chart, Saturn rules during the day. If it were a night chart, Mercury would be more prominent as a triplicity ruler. And Jupiter is a participating ruler, so he's always helping out. And one way the Hellenistic astrologers use this is they use them as, for instance, the sun, if you're born during the daytime, the sun is your sect, you're a solar person. You're born under the half of the day that belongs to the sun. So the Hellenistic astrologer would look at the triplicity lords to see how your life would develop. So for instance, with Donald Trump, the first third of his life roughly would be a Saturn kind of existence. And if Saturn is well dignified, things go well for him. The middle third is a Mercury, and he ends with a Jupiter. Well, Jupiter is really good in his chart. He's got that nice trine to Uranus. It's the lord of his house of exaltation. So you'd expect his final third of his life to be, he'd be very comfortable, wealthy, prominent.
Okay, so you would take that planet, that triplicity lord, and then place it back into the natal chart and see what that planet is doing there in terms of
In other words, Saturn, Mercury, Jupiter give you a general sense of the flow of his life. Let's go back to his natal chart.
And that would be relating to the sun. So in terms of career, in terms of his identity and so
Partly
on.
in terms of career, but because the sun is his life force and is his sect ruler, it really is, it governs his whole life. And so where is his Saturn? Here's his Saturn. So the beginning of his life, he has Saturn in Cancer, which really is in its detriment. So it's not a great placement. And in terms of the dignity system, it's peregrine, so it really has no essential dignity. It has some accidental dignity. So it's not terrible, but it's the first third of his life. The middle third, he has a Mercury, which is peregrine. So again, it's not that exciting. And it's got some dignity. It's in the 11th house, which is a good house. It's the house of the good daemon, good, and it's the joy of Jupiter. So the 11th house is a nice house to be in. Mercury rules his second house. So this is a period when he underwent many bankruptcies in his business, midlife here. So that makes some sense. And then the final period, which he's in now, is the Jupiter. And Jupiter has dignity, and it's in the sign of Venus, so it's disposed by Venus, which is another benefic, and it favorably aspects, I left out the outer planets in this chart. So let me go to this chart. So it's favorably aspecting the Uranus here and the sun. So it's nicely trine the sun as well. So Jupiter is in really good shape in this chart, and it rules his place of acquisition. So you'd expect the final third of his life to go very smoothly, according to this technique.
And then also its lord, Jupiter's lord, you would also look at his dignity, thus, related
Right,
to
let's go back to the dignity table.
Because that looked pretty strong.
Here's Jupiter. Jupiter is a triplicity lord, and Jupiter's in his own term. So he's got two what we call minor dignities, which is good. And he has no debilities.
And he's ruled by Venus. And then Venus, in terms of dignity, in terms of power itself.
Very favorable, yeah. This is a quote from Dorotheus, from the Pingree translation. There's a newer one by Ben Dykes. But he's giving an example in Dorotheus. If the first of the lords, he's talking about triplicity lords, of Venus, is in a good place, and the second is in a bad place, then this condition in the matter of women, so he's looking about how this individual is going to get along with women, is good in the beginning of his age, his life, and the last it is bad. So he's going to have good relationships with women till midlife, and then he's going to have terrible relationships with women. after that.
Mhm.
He's looking at the only, is often in the literature, the older literature looks at the first two triplicity rulers, and the medievalists tend to add the third one in. So they
Mhm.
go a third, a third, a third. Dorotheus is looking at the first half of life as the first lord, the second half of life as the second lord.
Right.
Because the first lord of Venus triplicity indicates the first years, the second, the middle years. Oh, no, he is saying this, okay. And the third, the end of life, okay. But he doesn't mention the third lord of what the third lord of this triplicity is. So in other words, if I want to, how you're going to get along with women in your life, I look at Venus in your chart.
Mhm.
And I look at the sign that Venus is in. See, where's your Venus?
It's in Pisces
You're born during the day or at night? I can't remember.
during the day. Yeah.
Okay. So your first years of your relationship with women are governed by Venus. So if Venus is in a good shape in your chart, you're going to do really well with women. Your
Yes.
middle years is Mars. So if Mars is in good shape, you're still going to do very well with women. But if it's not in good shape, you probably have a lot of fights with them. In your older years, when you're my age probably, however the moon is doing in your chart will indicate how you're going to get along with women in your life.
That's interesting. So you better have some good dignified triplicity lord.
The Arabic parts are lots. In Greek times, they were called lots, or in Greek, it's kleros or kleroi,
Mm-hmm.
meaning a lot, which literally meant like a plot of land, a piece of land that you would get was a lot. And they also use the word lot for if they were gambling or choosing, they would use like little sticks or little pebbles and choose a lot to see who won or who lost. So
Exactly.
that's the etymology of that word. The lot of fortune is extremely important in Hellenistic. It's calculated this way. But in Trump's chart, I wanted to look at his lot of exaltation because that has to do with his eminence in society, his being exalted. So being elected president is being exalted.
I think in Italy, his son was quite close to that point, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he has a day chart because his sun is up in the 10th house. Is the ascendant plus the degree of exaltation of the sun minus the sun. So basically, you take the distance from the sun to the point where the sun is exalted, or the degree where the sun is exalted, and you add that distance to the ascendant to get the lot of exaltation.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about this formula, and it's not clear to me whether this is true for the other lots, but here they're using the degree, an entire degree, not just a point, because the exaltation of the sun is not a point, it's a degree, it's a full degree, it's a little space of the zodiac, a lot of the zodiac. And in Western astrology, it's usually taken to be from 18 to 19 of Aries. It's the 19th degree. There's a great site, if you want to read about this, Curtis Manwaring, called the Astrology X-Files. Lots of great articles about Hellenistic astrology. Oh, and then I wanted to talk about profections, because this was the key method to analyze the year ahead, I think from Hellenistic through Persian Arabic times. The idea is you start with your birth chart, that's year 0. And so age 0 belongs to the first sign, the ascending sign. And all multiples of 12 belong, so age 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, etc., all belong to the first sign or house, the whole sign houses. Your second year of life, age 1, your third year of life, age 2, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so it's pretty easy. Trump was 70 years old when he won the election. So if this is 72, 71, 70, he's in an 11th house or 11th sign from the ascendant, perfection. Remember, his ascendant was Leo, so we have to go back 2 signs, Cancer, Gemini, right? He's in a Gemini perfection.
Exactly.
So Gemini and Mercury become really important at age 70. They kind of dominate the year. And whatever they mean in the birth chart and in the solar return will dominate the year. And in Hellenistic astrology, Mercury was actually called the Lord of the Year. Okay, in Vedic, they do it a little differently. They have 5 choices and they look at
Yes, the
strength and
strongest.
which
Yeah,
one aspects the ascendant and
yeah,
choose. But in Hellenistic, it's just the Lord of the perfected ascendant is the Lord of the year. I actually like the Vedic method better. I think it's more thoughtful. So what this is saying, when we look at the year of the election, we have to pay special attention to Mercury and Gemini. Okay. And this is the idea of distribution or divisions. The idea is that primary directions have to do with the rotation of the Earth. So from the moment of birth, the Earth is still turning. And so in the first 6 hours after birth, the Earth makes a quarter turn. And from Ptolemy, I guess this was the tradition in Hellenistic times, each degree that crosses the midheaven was thought to be equivalent to 1 full year of life. Each degree of the equator, there are equatorial degrees or right ascension. So from the time you're born to say 90 degrees later, crossing the midheaven on the equator would correspond to about 90 years of life. So, and that's about 6 hours of time. So that should be an indication of how your life will unfold. So for instance, here's Trump's chart. He has the end of Leo rising. When he's 70 years old, this point down here, this is in the term or bound of Venus, it's about 25 of Libra, will be on the ascendant. Because by then, 70 degrees will have crossed the midheaven.
Yeah.
Okay. So this becomes a very important planet, the Venus, because it's going to be governing the ascendant in his 70th year. And any planet that closely aspects this 25 of Libra, which happens to be Venus itself, becomes especially important that year. So age 70 is a really important Venus year. So we got Mercury really important because it's Lord of the Year, and Venus really important because it's going to be ruler of the directed ascendant, the primary directed ascendant. That clear or?
That's very clear, yeah.
Good. What I did was to show it. This is I took his natal chart. I found the right ascension of his midheaven, which is 5156, and added 70 because 70 years corresponds 70 degrees. And then I recalculated his birth chart so that it would have a midheaven with a right ascension of 121.56, exactly 70 degrees later, which should be 70 years later. And this is the chart I got with this midheaven. At his birthplace, a little over 25 of Venus on the ascendant. What's interesting about this chart, this is sort of the equivalent of a primary directed chart. This year, the midheaven is changing signs. Whenever an angle changes signs, or a planet, a directed planet change, that's a really big event astrologically, and usually corresponds to a major life change. So from this alone, you could say there should be a major career change during this year, age 70. Because the midheaven is what, 29, 40.
A shift into Leo.
I remember Leo is his natal ascendant, and Leo contains Regulus and his natal Mars, which is extremely powerful. And that's going to occur. This is age 70 on his birthday, so that's in June. The shift is going to occur in the fall during the elections. So that, to me, that's quite striking.
Yeah.
Mercury, which is his Lord of the Year, is in the 10th whole sign house. I was looking at whole sign houses. Okay, that's what I was doing. These are, I left it in Placidus, but I like to look at whole sign too. Mercury is in the 9th Placidus, but it's in the 10th whole sign of Libra rising, so the 10th sign from that is Cancer. So again, that could be a major career change. I'm not sure what the 9th house implication is. Jupiter which is the Lord of the Orb, which I don't think I've discussed yet.
Not
That's
yet.
a planetary hour ruler. But remember, he was born during a Jupiter hour,
Yes.
and it's a 7-year cycle because there's 7 visible planets. So he's in his 10th cycle. 10 times 7 is 70. So he is in a Jupiter period. And Jupiter is stationary in his natal chart and rules his house of acquisition. So that's very powerful. And
Yes.
Venus, which we saw was powerful because of primary directions, where it lies near the midheaven. And it squares the directed. So here's Venus near the midheaven in the 10th whole sign house, almost exactly square the ascendant. So there's a very strong career emphasis this year and an indication of a major career change. And it's very beneficial because it got both Jupiter and Venus highlighted at age 70. I mean, the two benefics, okay.
It's very interesting how it narrows down and makes it quite clean cut, I would say.
This is the Lord of the Orb, which I hadn't explained. He's born during a Jupiter hour, and he's born with Leo rising. So I just did a spreadsheet, and I list the planets in Chaldean order here. I left out a whole section. His age, his date of birth, and subsequent years, the ascendant and the subsequent signs, and the house it's in. So when he gets to age 70, this is June of 2016, the election was in November of 2016, he's in a Jupiter period as far as his planetary hour goes, and he's in a Gemini period as far as his ascendant goes, perfected ascendant, and he's in the 11th house whole sign. It is his 10th house Placidus. Let's go back. Ferdaria is a Time Lord system, very similar to a Dasha system, and it's based on the sect, whether you're born during the day or the night. And it's the same for everybody. If you're born during the day, you always start with the sun, and if you're born at night, you start with the moon. And the planets have a fixed amount of time that they govern. So he's born during the day. He starts with the sun. When he gets to age 70 in June, he enters his North Node period. In Western astrology, the North Node is considered sort of kind of beneficial. It brings a lot. It brings riches. It brings fame. I read one article that said a great number of Academy Award winners received the Academy Award in their North Node Ferdar. I don't know if that's true, but I read it.
I think it's definitely a serious change and an exploding.
Right. It brings expansion
and it's a very worldly planet also. That's also from the Vedic angle. It's very
what planet? I didn't hear what you said.
Worldly.
Worldly.
Yeah. A lot,
This is an interpretation for the Solar Fire program that I use. It can be a most fortunate time. You receive awards for your efforts, satisfaction for a job well done, promotions, new opportunities pour into your life. So that's what we would expect in this North Node period. So he's got Jupiter, Venus, and the North Node strongly highlighted this year.
And isn't his North Node also in his 10th house?
Right, with Placidus houses in his natal 10th house, the Sun, North Node, and Uranus are all conjunct. And they form a very close trine to Jupiter. And so when the North Node and Jupiter are both highlighted by these Persian Arabic techniques, by perfection, by Lord of the Orb, by Ferdaria. Remember we said this natal promise could promise a sudden dramatic improvement in his career. It's definitely activated this year because Jupiter is activated and the North Node is activated.
Yeah.
So
I also see that the North Node's Lord is in the 11th house.
And the North Node's Lord is Mercury, which is also activated.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is a very powerful year for this guy.
Clearly.
Here's his solar return. So I did his solar return for his birthplace. I actually don't know where he was on his birthday that year because he was campaigning for president. If I knew, I would have done it for his location as well. I would look at both. But since I don't have that information, in his solar return, Leo is rising. Now, natally, Leo is rising as well. And in Western astrology, when the same sign rises in the solar return, that's generally considered a very important year in which the indications of the birth chart are more likely to manifest.
Mm-hmm.
In Vedic, what I've read is that that's considered an unfortunate year in general. Birth ascendant represents when you came into the world, and that going through labor is a very painful process. So when you repeat your birth ascendant, it's like a rebirth, and you're going to go through the labor again to get reborn. It's like you were born once, and every time your ascendant repeats, you get born again. But being born is not an easy process for the mother or the baby.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But this time you're conscious of the pain of going through the birth canal. Mercury was very important. I calculated the part of exaltation in the solar return. It's at 0 Gemini 46, and his Mercury in the solar return is 0 Gemini 45 57. So it's virtually exact.
Mm-hmm.
The Mercury, which is the Lord of the year, in the solar return is exactly practically to the minute conjunct the part of exaltation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a year he should be really prominently exalted, according to this theory. To me, that was the most amazing thing I found doing this, that the Mercury here is really exactly the part of exaltation in the solar return. To me, that's astounding. I mean, it could hardly be closer.
Did you check it also on other prominent figures? I mean, do you have experience with this? Yeah, okay.
I don't have a lot of experience. I mean, I've gone through the charts in Vettius Valens, and he makes use of these techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So he seems pretty convincing. He used it a lot, so I take his word for it. But I'm generally not that interested in how prominent people are eminent there, except in a case like this. So it'd be interesting to go back to George Bush and see if any of this holds up in his chart.
From the Vedic, more from the Gemini angle, if you look at some important power points like Raja Yoga points or techniques, then you see that pile up. It's becomes stronger and stronger the more you look at it from different angles, that it's really building up. There's no mistake about it.
But that's what we're doing here. We're going through these 19 points and seeing how they reinforce each other or not. And here we're getting constant reinforcement.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that different astrologers, different times, different cultures find their own techniques to explain these kind of things. And they're so different. And I think that's very, very interesting. Yeah, so I think we can learn a lot from this whole reviving of Hellenistic tradition as Vedic astrologers too.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I put his natal chart in the middle and superimposed the solar return chart outside. Well, here, Mercury's Lord of the Year, we see that goes right up into the 10th house at the top of the chart. That's very prominent. And it's right on the point of exaltation, so... The natal Jupiter, which is very prominent because it's the Lord of the Orb, is in the first house. It's conjunct the node. This is a year when Jupiter, the node, is stressed because the node rules his Ferdar this year.
Mm-hmm.
So Jupiter is trine the node natally, and then it's conjunct the node, and that's what within a degree practically. But whenever, this is Marinus's point, when a factor repeats in the solar return, so Jupiter is strongly connected to the north node natally by a trine. That's really good.
Mm-hmm.
When will that be triggered? Marinus would say that will be triggered in a year when Jupiter makes a strong aspect to the node.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have a conjunction. So that will trigger the natal Jupiter node trine. So we have a Jupiter trine Rahu natally, Jupiter conjunct Rahu in the solar return. The conjunction triggers the natal configuration. And so that node, that trine can now manifest. He can have a sudden rise in prominence.
Mm-hmm.
Unexpected Uranus. A sudden unexpected rise in prominence. And what's interesting, he has a very angular Mars, right? Mars is right on the fourth cusp in Scorpio, so it's quite dignified. Angular planets are always very important in solar returns.
Sure.
And Mars in his natal chart was really highly dignified. So this is a year when Mars becomes really prominent. He can win a battle, basically, because Mars is warriors. generals fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And he has an extremely strong Mars that gets activated. If we look back here in the point system, his Mars had 17 points of dignity. That's quite impressive. And Mars, if you look across, is in its own term and face, and it's in Leo. So it's, I'm not sure where the 17 points came from, but it has 2 minor dignities and it has a lot of accidental dignity. So it's very strong. And then, so Mars gets activated by being on an angle. So if he's in a fight, he's likely to win.
I also see that Venus in the solar return chart is conjunct the natal sun.
Yeah. Venus is conjunct the natal sun in the solar return chart. Venus is at 2444 of Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting because natally, the part of exaltation is at 25 of Gemini. So Venus is almost exactly conjunct the part of exaltation.
And Venus was important because as the ruler of Jupiter in the natal horoscope.
It rules Jupiter, but it also rules the directed ascendant that year.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's the ascendant ruler of the directed chart. And it's applying to conjoin the part of exaltation. One thing I do with solar returns, is this his solar return? Yeah, here's the Venus, is I do the secondary progressions of the solar return throughout the year. And if you look at this, by secondary progression, Venus should move about 1 degree during a year because it's 1 day of life is equal to 1 year of life. Secondary progression just advances the chart a day in the ephemeris for each year of life.
Mm-hmm.
If we advance, so in 1 day, Venus moves approximately 1 degree.
Mm-hmm.
It's a quarter of a degree away from 25. A quarter of a degree would be a quarter of a year, about 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
He's born in June, so July, August, September, Venus will have entered 25 of Gemini and be in the degree of exaltation natally.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the election was in November. So Venus is well within his degree of exaltation at the time of the election. So he's got the degree of exaltation highlighted twice here in the solar return and in the natal chart.
Wow, it's impressive.
Well, I wish I had done this before the election.
Yeah, it's always easy afterwards, but you know.
Well, I was trying to understand astrologically, what did I miss? Because I hadn't looked at it from this angle. And
mm-hmm.
Here's the solar return. The only angular planet is this Uranus right on the midheaven.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were to interpret that, midheaven is career, Uranus is sudden, unexpected change. So
yes.
We would expect an unexpected, unusual change in his career this year, and it certainly happened.
Absolutely, and it's also Aries there, you know. So it's also the way how he went about it. Also, it was really demolishing, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's Aries, both the sign and the term. The midheaven's in the term of Aries too, so sort of the term of Mars. So sort of got a double Mars influence. Very interesting.
Thank you, Anthony, for this elaborate analysis. I also want to mention to the audience that we're going to do another session on triplicity lords and on Anticia and contra Anticia, two very fascinating concepts coming from Hellenistic astrology. Thank you very much for your time and effort. Do you have a website?
I have a blog on WordPress. It's just Tony Lewis. If they do Tony Lewis, one word, TonyLouis, and then WordPress and Google it, it'll pop up.
And also you have that event coming up in Spain.
Right. Next week I'll be going to the 36th Iberian Congress of Astrology in San Sebastian, Spain. I'll be speaking about solar returns.
Great. So I can put a link also if you can send me. I'll just put a link.
Oh, sure.
In the description.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So thank you for your time and effort.
My pleasure. It was fun.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.